So here we go, Unit 2, the American Revolution. On your chart, this is where you're going to put it, up here, American Revolution. So again, jot down 3, 4, 5 things that you find interesting about this unit. And there's a lot in this one. It's not going to be as long as Unit 1, but there's a lot of good information and fun information. I think one of my most favorite units to teach here. So let's start. The French and Indian War kicks off in 1754 between the French and the British in the New World, in America, because they both want control of the Ohio River Valley. And the French already have control of it. The British, they want to take it. And so they both have Native American allies, and that's why it's called the French and Indian War. All right. It goes on for quite a few years, and it actually sparks a global conflict called the 7 Years' War that lasts for 9 years. But in 1763, the British finally win, and King George is successful, and the British acquire a bunch of new territory all the way to the Mississippi River, the Ohio River Valley, and all the way to the Mississippi River. All of that becomes British. And so King George has another problem after his defeat. This was a costly war, and he has to figure out how to pay back the debt from the war, because he owes a lot of money to different people that the English crown borrowed money from. So in order to do that, he has to go back on the long-standing policy of salutary neglect, saying, hey, we don't care what you do as long as, we're making money. And they start imposing different taxes that the Native Americans don't really like. And so here's a map, actually, of all of this in orange is what the British won during the French and Indian War. And remember, the American colonists are British. So the American colonists from the 13 American colonies were fighting on the side of the British to take this land from the French. All right. And after that, they imposed, the British started imposing this line, these things like this Proclamation Line of 1763, which says that no colonist can go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the American colonists are like, hey, wait, we just fought for all of this land. We spent our own troops. A lot of people died to get that land, and you're going to tell us we can't even settle up there? We can't make our houses there? So they were upset about that. And then a year later, they start imposing taxes like the Stamp Act, which is just a tax on paper goods, and more taxes come. We get different things, and we get the Quartering Act in 1765, the first Quartering Act, which simply says that American colonists have to house British soldiers. If a British soldier comes to your door and says, I need you to wash my clothes and I'm going to sleep in your bed tonight and you need to cook me a meal, they would have to do that. And that's called quartering, and that's very important. The Tea Act in 1763, all this is going on, and it goes on for almost 10 years before things get really crazy. All right, and when they get really crazy, it kind of starts with the Boston Massacre, which happens in Boston, and it's where British troops fired on American colonists outside of an import house in Boston, if I remember correctly. And that's followed by the Boston Tea Party later on after the passage of the Tea Act, which American colonists dressed up as Native Americans and dumped British tea into the Boston Harbor. So that was the last straw, and that's when the British started getting really aggressive. And they imposed the Intolerable Acts, which closed the Boston port, put in a new Quartering Act, and really it was meant to punish the colonists. Instead, it made them fight. And we get to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which is now known as the Shot Heard Around the World. We'll talk about that in depth. All right, there's multiple battles that go on, starting with the Battle of Lexington and Concord for the next quite a few years. And during this time, the American colonists decide to start their own government, their own form of government, and it's called the Continental Congresses. And the Second Continental Congress is very important because they did something that changed the world forever. What they did was they wrote the world's greatest breakup letter in the Declaration of Independence, and they sent it to the king, and it essentially just says, King George, you have treated us so badly, we're breaking up with you. Bye. And, it doesn't make America free by any means, but it just says we intend to not be part of the British Empire anymore. We will be free, and we're willing to fight for it. And these are the things you've done to us to make us feel that way. All right, so more battles are fought. Bunker Hill goes on. These battles go on for years. And it's important to note that the British wore red coats, and they're called redcoats. The American colonists wore blue. All right. We have a long winter at Valley Forge, where General Washington, who was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, they have a lot of issues during that winter in Valley Forge. Starving. There's no food. People are sucking on their bootstraps just to get the salt out of it. There's disease going around. Smallpox is running rampant. But we do get some foreign help, and at the end of that winter, the American armies actually comes out ready to fight, and they come out and they start winning major victories all the way until the end of the war, which ends with the Battle of Yorktown, when the remaining British army in the Americas is surrounded by General Washington and a few French commanders and other foreign entities, and they force the British to surrender, thereby effectively ending the hostilities in the American Revolution. And America actually gets its independence formally granted about 2 years later with the Treaty of Paris of 1783.